you probably need to restart this.
Let me take my jacket off.
Let's see, so we'll just close this and start over again. Should be all right. See, this is 206. There you go. You're all set.
Thank you very much. So we got video and audio?
Yep.
Great. Okay. I'm Greg Gordon from SSRN, and I want to thank John for the chance to come back. I was in Chicago a few years ago, and we had a nice conversation about what SSRN was, and I think at this point in time we've grown a bit, and most people know who SSRN is. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of how we see authority changing in law schools and universities in general, and more importantly, how to make it, how to make your venture, whatever it may be, a repository, a journal, or just your center, sustainable based on some relationships. Now, normally, when I get a chance, I would give the SSRN is great speech and tell how wonderful our downloads are and how many authors we have and all of those kind of things. But I've got a little less than an hour here, and so it's pretty early in the day, but you'd fall asleep probably within about 10 minutes. So we're going to talk about a couple of other things. What we are going to talk about is authority and changing the changing tide, so to speak. One of the things that I noticed in my recent presentations is how I've started to add Twitter hashtags to the initial page on the presentations, and I was thinking to myself, how many times have I even seen a hashtag before late 2008 at a conference, and now everywhere I go they're being tweeted nonstop. We were at the Society of Scholarly Publishers, about as staid a group as you can imagine, and they had several hundred tweets during their conference. So it's just the way that it is. The other thing that will happen is Stacey Regini, who works with me on our blog, will also be blogging about the conference and this presentation and what we're seeing from the law community, because the law community is significantly different than a lot of the other communities that we deal with, most directly opposite to the accountants. And I probably don't need to give a lot of details from that perspective. Since they're taping the presentation, there's only really two rules, and we've got a nice sized group. If there's something that doesn't make any sense, if I say something that just completely flies in the face of what you understand things to be, raise your hand, holler out a question, and let's get it addressed right there so that we can get it cleaned up and moved on. And if there's any complaints whatsoever about SSRN, that you wait until she's done finishing taping, and then we'll talk about those after the taping's done. So one of the things is that kind of is an underlying question is, what is a scholarly authority? And it used to be the ivory tower, or the right school, being in the right conference, the journal with the highest impact factor, but not anymore. The top schools and journals aren't going anywhere, but almost anybody can be an authority in this day and age. John spoke about it quite a bit as far as what's creating authority. And I just thought it was amazing that Twitter decided to not have their scheduled maintenance based on an event occurring in the world. That is just an absolutely incredible time in which we are living in. And the thing that we'll talk about in a little more detail from the SSRN perspective is that to be an authority, you need to have critical mass, not necessarily of content, but really of relationships. In fact, those relationships are what's critical, in social media and all of the different things happening on a network perspective, I think, support that. So let's define critical mass. Princeton's WordNet defines it as what you see there: a minimal amount required to start or maintain a venture, or a minimum mass of fusible material that can sustain a chain reaction. As much fun as it would be to talk about the second one, we're going to focus on the first one today and how it relates to what we're seeing from a content and relationship standpoint. Obviously, things are changing. There is incredible movement with the open access decisions at Harvard and Stanford and MIT earlier this year. It's kind of interesting to see. We wrote a blog post on Monday about the fact that Maryland denied the open access, or voted down the open access decision. our take on it, at least in our blog post, was that it was partially contributed by the humanists, and that the humanists really wanted to kind of maintain the status quo. And we talk a little bit about the differences between law and social sciences and hard sciences and the humanities. But you know, they seem to be, I don't want to say stuck, but more focused on keeping the traditions the way that they are, and not really willing to make movement going forward. One of the things that we're also seeing, though, is that working papers, a lot of my publisher friends would make fun of us in saying, who in the heck wants working papers? You know, that gray literature stuff doesn't really have a lot of value. We created a technology called SiteReader that looks at all of the content in the SSRNE library, analyzes the references. We're actually in the process of analyzing all the footnotes, which has its own little nightmares attached to it, and then identifying what papers are being referenced from other papers. We've got over 5 million references that we've analyzed now, and about 13 or 14% of them are to working papers. So we're starting to see, again, there's a slight bias obviously within our community, but we're starting to see research papers reference working papers as the, you know, as really truly valuable content and research. In fact, last year, 2 Supreme Court decisions referenced working papers in the SSRNE library. So we're starting to see that working papers, you know, if they're written by somebody that you respect, they're certainly high enough quality that they don't have to be published. And so there's kind of this current changing of things that is making a difference in what is considered scholarly communications. One of the other things that was interesting is that last year, Josh Marshall's TalkingPointsMemo.com received the George Polk Award for journalism. So this highly coveted journalistic designation was recognized for a blog, the first time ever. And again, a significant changing of the tides. And I don't need to talk about newspapers because that's all over the place, and you've probably read more than I have in that area. But let's take a look at kind of what's causing these changes. We're just not dealing with a garden hose anymore. We're not, in fact, dealing with a fire hose. The amount of content that's being produced and coming across your desks is absolutely amazing. You know, the 2 questions that I usually ask at this point are, you know, how many of you are reading everything in your field? And more importantly, how many of you even know what everything in your field is anymore? You know, it seems like you open up and find another blog, and the next blog that you read is just an incredible amount of content, and you're like, oh my God, how did I survive without reading this blog? And then it's just one more to go into the RSS reader, and one more thing to kind of feel like you're getting behind on. The analogy that I use is that it used to be where it was a scarce model, like trying to get a glass of water from a dripping faucet. And now we've gotten to the point where you're trying to drink from a fire hose, but the analogy that I actually like is, you know, when you walk in and you turn on the water quickly if you're washing a bowl in the sink, and the water splashes out and it whips around the bowl and it gets you wet or it gets the counter wet. That's what we're talking about, is trying to capture that information out of that fire hose now. Just like splashing the water in the bowl in the sink, it's just not, it's not any easier to get content that is appropriate for you out of the fire hose as it was to get it from the dripping faucet. Michael Jensen, actually not my Michael Jensen, but Michael Jensen, the other Michael Jensen, one of the other Michael Jensens, in the Chronicle of Higher Education about 1.5 years ago, used the term endless information abundance. And I think that really describes what we're talking about as far as how much content is out there. It truly is endless. The greatest complaint that we get at SSRN is that we're giving you too damned much research. You know, stop the flow, so to speak. If you follow SSRN, we have announcements every week of 1 or 2 more e-journals, 1 or 2 more universities or schools or departments that are joining the e-library to distribute their content. There's more content coming every single day. What you're seeing is a lot of the content starting to come from open access publishers. We work, I know John Malinsky, who's at Vancouver, now at Stanford. He helped create the open journal system within the PKP project. And I saw John just a couple months ago, and if you think of those people who are using OJS as micro publishers, John said, I think this is probably a few months old, that there's over 2,500 open journal system publishers now. And that technology's only been around for a few years. So you have 2,500 new publishers. Now, granted, most of them are only publishing 1 or 2 journals, but that's 2,500 more journals coming out of one piece of technology developed open source in Canada just a few years ago. Ram Crow wrote a piece of research for Spark, and he said that the number of scholarly journals was doubling every 22 years. He and I actually were on a panel together in November, and he said that that number is now approaching 20 years. So we will soon be below 20 years for the entire number of scholarly journals that are out there to be doubled. It's just an incredible amount of content. The other stat, and I think I just like this one because it's just an interesting one personally, is that 90% of all scientists that ever lived are alive today. So you have an incredible amount of content being written by an incredible amount of scientists, and both of them are growing numbers. I follow this service from ProQuest called Papers Invited, and it basically sends me every month who has calls for papers, and so I follow a number of the areas that we have. And I just happened to look at the April Papers Invited email that told me about calls for papers had 523 calls for papers. And that's not all the calls for papers. Those are a small segment of what's out there that I just happen to be following because they're in our content areas. So 523 calls for papers in 1 month in a small sliver of the number of conferences and meetings that are out there. Another aspect of increased content is the access to earlier stage research. As we talked about, the accountants in general like to keep things cloistered until the last possible moment, and then they kind of want to spring it on us and wonder why it isn't posted and distributed immediately. The lawyers, on the other hand, follow what I call the Larry Solom approach. And Larry, as you know, is a very influential blogger and a pretty nice guy. And at AALS a year or two ago, he discussed what he calls the 3-version paper. And so his first version that he'll post to SSRN is kind of the idea paper, 8 to 10 page paper that basically gets the idea out there, more or less puts his stake in the ground that this is his idea, kind of claim that territory. Now, interestingly enough, when Larry made this presentation, I talked to some folks. They actually were telling me about some law professors on the West Coast that were actually not even bothering with the 8 to 10 page paper. They were actually going with a 3 to 5 paragraph abstract as kind of their staking the claim in SSRN to keep their ideas to themselves. So Larry talked about then, obviously, the idea paper. Second one being the draft, kind of the one that's circulated widely for comments, workshopped around, and then kind of the final version that's actually submitted to a law review or distributed or other journal or distributed in whatever fashion makes it most appropriate. Now, obviously, I have a bit of a bias, but if you're following content in this particular area, you're now seeing 2 to 3 times as much research because you now have access to it at an earlier stage. So your research that you need to follow is effectively doubling or tripling just because of it being accessed at earlier stages. Another significant area is interdisciplinary, both classifications and subjects. So with what the numbers that you're seeing here is when we look at the way that people are storing content that they're reading in the SSRN library. Back in 2004, it was 1.85 classifications for the articles that were being saved. And in 2008, that number increased to over 4.25. So you're seeing content from a number of different areas that you find to be valuable in your areas of research. This is not just due to classifications, but also just due to the increase in interdisciplinary subjects. We started the Entrepreneurship Research and Policy Network with the Kauffman Foundation about 4 years ago. Obviously, that's completely interdisciplinary. We recently announced Cognitive Science with Mark Turner at Case and Corporate Governance with Lucian Bebchuk at Harvard. So we're coming to a point where these interdisciplinary subject areas that touch on us in different ways and forms are becoming more and more prevalent. And that's actually one of the areas that we think we do a pretty good job in because we bridge the gap of many subjects and allows a lot of people to play. But again, it's increasing the amount of content that you're being exposed to and trying to stay on top of. Somebody in our office found this, and this is a little bit hard to read in this particular room, but what you are actually seeing is it's an analysis of interdisciplinary classifications. And you've got law up here at the top, and then the life sciences are generally in green here. But what you're seeing is the connectivity of law to international studies, to economics, and then into these different areas. So you're seeing a lot of additional connectivity between different subject areas as they reference one another, as they build upon the ideas of one another, and we'll talk about innovation in a few minutes, but as they become more and more connected. And as they become more and more connected, the simple example I use is, if you're doing research on Sarbanes-Oxley, and you only look at the accountant's perspective, you're missing a lot. If you only look at the legal perspective, you're missing a lot. You need to have a well-rounded view of both perspectives to allow you to come up with truly innovative research. Now, to kind of jump back a bit, we've talked a lot about historically about critical mass being associated with content, and that has traditionally been true. But when content is abundant, I'd make the argument that it's the relationships, that connectivity, that becomes much more valuable. Scarcity actually has not been a rule or even a concern since Yahoo's homepage looked like this. And it was Google who first understood that the connections, based on the eigenvector, that's what Google uses to determine their rankings, what they use to determine value in their paradigm. They started back in '99 using eigenvector as a basis for ranking websites. Now, many people consider SSRN to be an authority, even though we don't produce any content whatsoever. What we bring to the table are the relationships, the connection between the accountants and the lawyers and the economists and the cognitive scientists and the corporate governance scholars. We didn't approach this trying to figure out how to build those relationships, to be quite honest with you. We were just looking to try to provide easier, cheaper, more efficient access to content. But what we realized quickly was that one of the limitations in the existing paradigm was single classification, so that you in effect cloistered that content into a very narrow channel of a particular law review or a particular journal or a particular center's working paper series. By allowing authors to classify in multiple different areas across multiple networks, we built this interdisciplinary approach that just naturally fostered relationships that provide, we believe, very innovative opportunities for our scholars. One of the things that we also realized was that as we started to grow, we didn't have enough friends. Yes?
Can I ask you a question about when I search SSRM by topic, corporate governance, or say on pay, am I searching the full text of the working papers and articles, or just title, abstract, and the words that the authors have assigned?
If you use the current ssrn.com/search page, you're searching title, author, abstract body, and keywords. We have an advanced search that's actually in beta and will be rolled out this summer that includes full text. And we actually, I don't think I have it here, I actually have a slide of what that looks like. What happens with full text was when you're searching a couple of 100,000 documents, full text just gives you more stuff that you have to go and wade through. So what we did was we looked at the various, what we considered to be the best of breed, so to speak, and built a full text engine that allows you to do a lot of manipulation to the search results versus having to actually go in and look at all of the articles that you received as results before you find what you want. So there's a lot of granularity that we've added in, where it's been classified, who are the authors, what are the authors' affiliations. You can add and delete keyword terms to the search results. So it allows you to be much more narrow and refining in your search process than just giving you a bunch of results by searching the full text. There's another thing, actually, well, I'll talk about it what the heck. There's a technology that we saw at the Society of Scholarly Publishers Conference a couple of weeks ago. It is based on PubMed Central's database, and the technology is called PubGet, PUBGET.com. And so this is a third party who basically created a whole different way to look at the PubMed Central database. And actually, we are literally in the midst of building a beta site for that technology, because it completely changes the way that I think, you look at search results. In effect, all of the results are shown on the left side with links to the various components, be it references, citations, footnotes, and then the actual abstract page itself is on the right side. So it allows you to modify things and see things much more efficiently. And again, one of the things that we try to pride ourselves on is never thinking that we're the smartest guys or girls in the room. And every time I go to a conference, I keep getting reminded that we're not the smartest guys or girls in the room, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of incredible stuff. So, in fact, we've taken a page out of the pub-get model, and a beta has been promised to me by the end of the week after next. So, on SSRN web pages, if we have a beta version, you'll see a little beta tab. You do need to be registered and have a cookie so that we can follow your feedback and comments easier. But any page that has a beta tab on it, some of the rankings do, some other places do, you click on the beta tab and you're literally seeing what we're playing with behind the scenes. And so you will see on the search results page literally a beta tab in the next couple of weeks for a whole new paradigm of ways to look at it. Did I answer your question? Great. One of the quotes that came out of some of the things that we did with the Kauffman Foundation was Professor Barabasi at University of Notre Dame. And what he said about connections and relationships was, it's not how many connections you have, but also how many different communities you're connected to. And so that's kind of one of the cornerstones of what we've been building out our community on, is to try to build as many connections between different groups, between the different ways that we think. You know, people say you go to law school not to learn case law, but to think like a lawyer, and you go to, you know, you work in an accounting firm to learn how to think like an accountant. Well, we want to try to get the different thought processes together so that we can be doing some fun things. Now, when we then take a step back, unfortunately there's been a few hindrances to slowing innovation, but we think that it provides some really cool opportunities for people who are thinking about doing things differently. Innovation is obviously a ridiculously hot topic right now. It's you know, it's kind of the zen of management these days. I was on a call with somebody at MIT and then somebody at NYU Law talking about creating a combination economist, legal perspective innovation network. We blogged about innovation from the new book, The Innovation Zone, and I can't pronounce his last name, so I won't even bother trying, but that's Koupalopoulos, I think is how it's pronounced. A very good book. We talk about, you know, how that affects things as we see them. But, you know, when you talk about innovation, I think it's important to kind of just have a very basic definition. And so my simple definition is the ability to create new things by being exposed to a broader and deeper set of existing things. So if I can show the lawyer the accountant's view of Sarbanes-Oxley, if I can show the economist the manager's view of innovation, I believe that we can get some really creative things done and some very interesting research written. When scarcity was the model, then, you know, the huge dam approach worked very, very well. There's a smaller volume of papers, and you needed to make sure that they were cloistered, they were controlled, and they were distributed efficiently and effectively. The current model is not handling the research that's out there, and I would obviously argue that it's limiting innovation. I'm currently working with two very, very prominent journals. Neither one happens to be in law, but two very prominent journals. And those journals, both of them, have backlogs of what they have accepted. So, simple example, in one case, this journal has accepted papers that will not get distributed for 18 months. So every new paper they get is going to sit on the shelf for at least 18 months, and that lag is growing. So the conversation that I have with the editor right now is that he's going to have his staff take the final copy-edited version and post it to the SSRN library and make it freely available for that 18-month period prior to publication, so that at least that information is out there. And, you know, my hat's off to the editor, because that's incredibly forward-thinking about, you know, what it takes to get that content out there. You know, information, as they say, wants to be free. And then, to borrow a phrase from John Wilbanks of Scientific Commons, you know, not free as in free speech or free beer, but free as in a free puppy. And as my youngest daughter keeps coming home and telling me that the dog is free. I keep trying to explain to her that no dog is free, that there's much more cost to maintenance than there is to acquisition, but that's a different conversation. Free does not mean easy. Nancy Foster and Susan Gibbons at the University of Rochester wrote a very good paper a few years ago about repositories, and basically the end of their conclusion was that just because you build it does not mean they will come. We've seen that you really need to build, in our case, an author-focused model for them to come, and we've been very successful by creating an environment that they actually want to come and be a part of. In effect, a community more than just simply a repository. So now, whenever I get into this, immediately we start to talk about social networking and Web 2.0 and all of the, the slides actually, I think I built it a couple months ago and it's old already. Probably could put up 2 or 3 times as many things. We just added to our blog a share, and you click, you've got the standard ones in the first one, and you click the expand, and the thing grows to like 45 different ways to share in social networking and media communities. I'm just and probably older than that right now. I hate the term Web 2.0, probably because I don't really understand it. And when my people who know that friends and family know what I do, they say, well, what does it mean? And I don't really have a good definition. But what I do say is that, there's a lot of people out there who want to create content and share it. And, how do you get the right incentives in place so that that content can be shared efficiently and effectively and created and shared in a way that is useful, valuable to the people reading it on the other side? And that's one of the things that we struggle with at SSRN is, what determines value, what determines authority? Is it your ranking methodology? Is it who wrote it? Is it the affiliation of the author? As we talked about a moment ago, hashtags are starting to become, kind of another way to get access to content. I regularly talk to librarians, and they're constantly struggling with what is the final version, what goes into the repository, how to actually build a repository that has value, and God forbid you actually allow revisions to it, because that scares many of them to no end. A brief aside, there's an interesting article, I think Clay Shirky references it, if not, it was somebody else who referenced it, so that I found out about it. There's an interesting article in 1995 by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. And in this article, what Putnam describes in a very, very condensed fashion right now is that bowling increased as an activity. More people were bowling throughout the late 80s and early 90s, but less people were bowling in leagues. And so what he talks about is the decline of these social networks, this social capital, because less people, you would still bowl, but you wouldn't do it as with your friends or with your family or with your spouse. You would basically just go and bowl like you did an activity. It wasn't like you would do it in a community setting. And so his argument is that social capital is decreasing. And it's interesting because, if you think about the timing of that, the mid-90s, that was really before any of the social networks, any of the social media that we consider to be the norm today was in existence. Things were just really getting started back then. So I read that article and I kind of think that was more or less the turning point, is that we've now gotten around that corner where social capital is being built, but it's being built virtually. And so it's, again, about the relationships. It's about how do I get different people into my network. Interestingly enough, there's a couple months ago, there's a New York Times article about YouTube and about how it was increasing its prominence as a research tool, starting to, in some schools, starting to actually surpass Google. As John referenced, of course I went to Wikipedia and of course I went to Google to do my research paper, but actually that more and more people are starting to use YouTube as their first stop for their quote-unquote school research. Obviously not at the college or graduate level, but at the younger ages. And then there was an interesting conversation in the last, I think it's the current issue of Wired, and then Tipping Point Labs blog. They're talking about YouTube and Hulu as being the replacements for network television as a platform. And again, it's not exactly what we're talking about, but the point here is that there really isn't anything that's too big to be replaced. You know, if YouTube's starting to attack Google, and YouTube and Hulu are starting to attack the networks, you know, everything's up for grabs. Now, we started looking at relationships and social networks early, and this is the in one of the presentations I pulled from the late 90s, kind of how we looked at the SSRN network, and it, you know, as it takes into account the content and the content creators, and some of the terms are a little bit small, but basically what you're looking at is the different stakeholders within the SSRN community, and how we then consider them to be integral parts of this sphere we call the SSRN. We then realized that we really didn't know what we were talking about, so we started working with some consultants, and as consultants will always do, they'll provide you with at least one really good-looking, really complicated diagram that you really have no idea what in the hell it means. But it adds a little color on a slide. But you know, in effect, the takeaway from this is that there's a lot of components to the community, and every constituent matters. You know, if I don't have authors contributing content, I don't have anything to distribute. I don't have anything to share. If I don't have readers reading that content, I'm not going to have the authors providing the content. If I don't have both of those, I'm not going to have a platform in which schools want to outsource their research paper series distributions. Conferences want to use our community for aggregating their content, reviewing their papers, doing all of these activities online, and providing, in effect, them with the tools to not have to worry about it. So again, it's about the constituents and about the relationships, and thank God that the consultants were a friend of mine and didn't charge us hardly anything, because I can't imagine how much this would have cost us based on the number of characters on the slide. One of the other things that we've been focused on is internationalization. As you start to look at relationships, you know, to think that everything is U.S. focused is about as naive as it can be. And so we've made a big push over the last few years to add more foreign editors, more foreign content. We're working with Bar-Ilan School of Law in Israel about creating a Hebrew language network. Working with some folks in Brazil about creating, you know, SSRN in Portuguese. So, you know, as we look to the next few years, the internationalization, not just of editors, again, providing different perspective, of content coming in different languages, but actually looking to replicate the SSRN model in different and other languages. This is a Wordle tag cloud. Now, the United States is still by far the dominant provider of content, but what you're seeing is, you know, the United States is actually about a quarter of the size that it would be if you took it as a true tag cloud, but most of the other countries are representative of the size that they're providing content to the SSRN library in, and it's just incredible to see how many different countries from all over the world have actually contributed content to SSRN. Now, once you get a significant amount of content, you start to have, you know, some wonderful economies of scale. And by providing access to this content freely and easily, we're starting to see incredible growth in the number of downloads. Now, downloads are always a funny number, so let me just take a second and say that we count all downloads. We do not display download counts for numbers that we do not verify and feel comfortable with. So if we look at 2008 specifically, we had 14.1 million downloads. We only displayed publicly, told the world about 7 million of them. So those are the ones where we were able to take out authors, you know, the crawlers, the robots, etc. People clicking the download button twice. Amazingly, as crazy as it may sound, we actually had some authors who, interestingly enough, their particular IP address might have had more than one download of their own paper. Certain that it was a glitch in the technology and nothing more, but we've eliminated those also and had conversations with those people when needed. So we feel very comfortable that the 7 million is actually a good number, and we're on track to significantly beat that in 2009. You know, one of the other things that we start to see is that with more content, you start to look at different ways to value the content. You know, as I've spoken a little bit about here, it's not just downloads. You know, downloads are a wonderful proxy because they can give somebody who is completely unknown the opportunity to become known. It could be the affiliation, it could be the author. You know, if I happen to be a big fan of Gene Fama or Ron Gilson, I really don't care where their content's published. I want to get the latest and greatest research from them. So if Ron puts up a paper or Gene puts up a paper today, I want it today. I don't need some third party to tell me that it's valuable information. So it can be the name, it can be the affiliation, and again, what we're seeing is a lot of different ranking methodologies. So we have downloads, we now have citations, and we're actually working with Carl Bergstrom on his eigenfactor, which basically looks at, as you see here, not just the you know, one-to-one relationship of current journal citations, but actually does a round robin about all the different relationships that occur based on who's citing who within this broader matrix. Again, taking the eigenvector and coming up with an eigenfactor, which allows a different type of ranking. From our perspective, you know, it's a roll your own. Pick whatever you want. If it's somebody's name you want to follow in an RSS feed, great. If it's downloads, great. If it's citations, great. And if it's eigenfactor, great. You know, each of them comes at it from a different perspective, and our goal is to provide as much content in as many different ways as possible so that you can pick and choose what makes the most sense for you at that given moment in time. Again, we just don't want to think that we're the smartest guys or girls in the room. Now, one of the other things that we see happening is that there's alternative models for publishing coming from OJS, John Walensky, and DPub, and also there's some interesting approaches to open review based on what Slashdot does with their Rate the Rater. Again, these are different ways to provide value to determining what you should read and what may be of interest to you. There's a really interesting paper called Kosa's Penguin, which talks about commons-based peer production. It's by Professor Benkler. And it's just a very good paper. It's several years old now, but it kind of gives you a flavor for how these things start to become valuable and help to build authority. You know, one of the things that we want to be thinking about is, you know, will your school or substitute journal or center or repository or whatever it is that you're building, you know, will it become an authority? And if it becomes an authority, what benefits do you receive from that? And the argument that I make is that at this moment in time, and I think John made it in a similar vein in the keynote, at this moment in time, it's completely wide open. Anybody can do just about anything to become an authority. You know, the bloggers who are winning the journalism awards, the schools that are up and coming with their new centers. You know, it provides an incredible environment, incredible opportunity for all of us to change the world, so to speak. And I, again, would state that the right relationships, especially in a changing environment, especially when things are new, are key to that. Now, if you become a scholarly authority, then I would argue you have the opportunity to have somebody actually care about what you're doing. So let me take a step back. One of the things I'm most concerned about is sustainability. Depending on your view, it actually could even be a moral obligation that once you take in content, that you actually have to make sure that the way that you're housing that content is sustainable. And 4 or 5 years ago, I was giving presentations about repositories. And so I would talk about institutional repositories and disciplinary repositories. And I had this really simple but kind of cool slide. And it had a big blue circle about all the good things about repositories. You know, you're centralized, it's access, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I had a tiny blue circle about the bad things. And the bad thing primarily was, what happens if you lose the data? You know, if I build a DSpace repository and my funding dries up, if I have a champion in the dean for this particular project for a journal or whatever, and then that dean leaves. If I lose my support for my project, and I've cloistered this content, if it's not an authority, then I'd argue that you run the risk of nobody caring and losing the data. I talk to librarians all the time right now in this environment where they're petrified about what they're going to do with their content. I'm working with Amy Brand at Harvard right now to take her Office of Scholarly Communications repository and actually fill it with the 8,000 papers we have in the SSRNE library. Because we have the content, and for her to try to go out and get that content from within would be an incredible task. And that's not what she wants to do. She wants to have that content available, but she wants to have it available in a way in which it's sustainable. Now, so as we talk about, how do we get to critical mass? How do we get to that level? The one thing I know, I think I know more than one thing, but in this particular case, the one thing I know is that, the right relationships, the relationship between SSRN and Amy Brand at OCS is going to make that repository very, very powerful, and we're having that same conversation with a few others. And then I would then argue that the being an authority is your best path to sustainability, but it's interesting when you look at what relationships start to do for reaching critical mass. And so what I'm going to try to do now is flip to a chart that hopefully, okay. All right, so what we see here is, no. All right, what you would have seen here was, we'll look at one for a second. What you would see there is actually a, oh, there it is. Okay, just a second here. I need to do this. So what you're looking at here is the number of submissions. So you're looking at submissions there, classifications there. Each of the circles is a unique entity. And we picked 100 or so of the, I think it's 50 of the top 100 schools that have contributed to SSRN. So we start off in 1999, and in 1999, so basically we're running about 10 years. So you've got, Columbia, Harvard, Cornell, Minnesota, etc. And then here's all of the list over on this side. But what we're basically looking at is, over time, the growth in submissions for an organization, the number of classifications, how much greater it becomes from an interdisciplinary standpoint. Again, each organization is its own color, and the number of authors affiliated with each organization. So what I'm showing you here is the growth in relationships based on the existing relationships, kind of the viral effect of SSRN across a couple dimensions. So it starts off relatively slow in the late 90s, early 2000, and then it starts to pop up. You see Harvard grow, Columbia, Princeton, several others. And then in the early 2000s, you'll see the World Bank and IMF jump up here as we built a relationship with them and started housing their content. There they come. So there's the World Bank.
Spinning out of the turn.
Exactly.
It's like a horse race.
And the IMF. But what you're starting to see is more, even the smaller schools or smaller centers, ECB grew significantly in the last couple of years. So what you're seeing, though, is that there's more content coming in. Again, number of submissions and number of classifications. So there's more content coming in from a broader array of schools, from, again, the size of the circle is the number of the authors, from a greater number of authors over time. So Harvard has 1,215 authors and 8,400 papers. Now, the argument there is that by providing the right environment for them to be successful, they will come. So I go back to this. Now, whenever I show that data, I'm kind of reminded of the fact that I actually have to, in my day job, kind of keep balance on two different surfboards. Because I really have no idea what the rules of this game are. I know that it's a new game that we're playing, but I have no idea what the rules are, and I don't even know that they've been written yet. So I have to keep one foot on the surfboard of existing scholars and maintain those relationships with, you know, the dozens of Nobel Prize winners that we currently have in the e-library and in the community. And yet I also have to appeal to the PhD candidates and the associate professors who are getting their content from Twitter and Facebook and everything else. And so trying to ride those two surfboards is what we try to do every day. And it reminds me of that famous Max Planck quote, you know, which is, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Or as a scholar said to me the other day, new ideas progress funeral by funeral. And so that's what we're dealing with. It is, in effect, a very difficult process, but we have to maintain the existing status quo to not alienate anybody who's already out there, but we have to be providing these tools for the future. Now, I am terrible at predictions, but I do think that there is one that I feel comfortable making, given the light of everything that I've spoken about and everything that we're seeing from SSRN's perspective. And so the prediction I'd make is that despite some recent setbacks, some comments to the contrary, I still do predict that Michael Phelps will compete and win gold in London in 2012.
Oh, come on.
Thanks again for the opportunity. We've got about 10 minutes, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any. John, it's your place.
All right, I'm going to ask a personal question.
Sure.
So, to sum up a portion of your presentation, we're in a marketplace of authority. Or, no, we're in a marketplace of competition for what is authority. What is scholarly authority? What should win? What should be the thing that determines what is good, what is quality? Not downloads, obviously, not just eyeballs. Certainly not downloads, because like the most downloaded law article is the one about the word F. Right?
Sure, Chris's paper. Yep.
Yeah. So what?
Well, from our perspective, I think that I think that we've gotten away from a question of what is authority, and moving towards a question of what is authority for you versus for me.
That's moral relativism. Come on, give me a.
Well, but
absolutism.
But you can't. Well, you know, you can't predict. You know, I mean, you could take.
Well, that's why I'm asking you personally.
Well, from my perspective is that as the longer I play in this game, the more I realize I have no idea what the hell the answer is, and therefore, you know, I mean, I said to Mike Jensen 10 years ago, I said the way we win is becoming Switzerland, so we don't take a side.
Okay.
And that's really what we've been trying to focusing on is, you know, listen, it's easiest for us to tout downloads. We have millions of downloads every year, and those millions of downloads allow us to look, you know, we're winning that game. But we realized that that wasn't necessarily the game. And so we added citations. And we weren't happy with CiteSeer, so we literally built our own technology called SiteReader. And right now, we're grabbing footnotes, and we'll be one of the first people out with the technology that actually can pull content references and such from footnotes and actually use them and provide them in a usable fashion. And then we talked to Carl Bergstrom and created, you know, we took his technology that was really cool for open access journals and spent a lot of money rejiggering that so that it works for our content. You know, so yeah, it is kind of a mealy-mouthed answer to say it depends. but you know, it really does depend. And that two surfboards really does work for me on a day-to-day basis, because I have partners and network directors who ask, why in the hell would we ever want a blog? And I'm at the Kauffman Foundation, and I have people saying, why the hell don't you have a blog?
Yeah, where's your blog?
You know, and then so we started a blog, and I specifically said, in our blog, we're not going to take a position on a paper, because that would be favoritism, or worse yet, you know, something else, and therefore, and then I get chastised in another blog, well, what do you mean you're not going to take a position on a paper? What the hell are you guys doing, you know? So we're trying to observe what we're seeing happening, yet people want us to try to take a position because they want us to pick and choose.
So I can't pay you to get a better rank in SSRN?
You know, I can't tell you how much money we could make if we were selling downloads.
No, I mean, that's besides the fact that that sounds like, the way I said it, it sounds evil. It's certainly happening all over the place in other marketplaces. I mean, you can pay to get to the top of Google search rankings. You can pay to get to the top of Martindale Hubble or other lawyer directories or things like that. I mean, is there, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is there an equivalent to come back to your sustainable thing? Is there an equivalent way to monetize ranking, I guess? That isn't evil.
Yeah, the way we look at it is we think of it as more providing author-centric tools, you know, so that everybody can do that. And so we're looking at a couple of things. Well, this is make it in a very simple sense. Think of it as if you had your own SSRN capability as an author. So you could put up on your author page, you know, the content that you thought was the most valuable content.
No, okay.
Now, that could be your papers, it could be, you know, your Finance 301 class, downloads, you click on a button, here's what they needed, you know, bankruptcy, you know, 503, whatever it is, here's the papers you need to read for this, click a button, you can get it printed in a hard copy, mailed to you for class, or these are the best of. The other thing that's happening is, we're along that same line would be the ability to say, you know, John, you downloaded Ron's paper, blah, blah, blah.
You might like.
Well, we have recommendations now.
Okay.
So we do have recommendations.
Automated or?
Fully automated, actually.
Based on keyword searches, essentially, or?
In effect, you have is the ability to so if we go to Jens's paper, Nature of Man, you'll see as an example. What we do now is, we just came out with it, we actually include people who downloaded this paper also downloaded that paper. A relatively simple mechanism, but that technology is now available here. Cognitive science is, Mark Turner's agreed for the whole network. Anything classified into the cognitive science network will have commenting added to it. So we're testing our commenting on a broad scale now. We've played around with it a little bit small.
Rating?
But,
5 stars, 4 stars?
I'm kind of avoiding that question, so let me give you a very straightforward or
Well, you gotta be
answer.
looking at it, right?
Well, here's the answer I would give you. If anybody here today were going to build a publisher, I don't think any of us would build a publisher in the way that the publishers currently exist.
Of course not.
So if I were to look at a sustainable model, I would clearly look at open review. I would clearly look at Vanquish Paper, Cosa's Penguin, and I would clearly look at Slashdot's approach to rating the rater as a methodology for providing a true commons-based peer review system. Obviously that technology is available to us, and obviously that technology has a lot of value, we think, to the community. So it would be foolish for me to say that we're not looking at that. We're looking at it very, very hard, because we think that that is the future for a true commons-based peer review system. You have to, my personal bias is that you have to incorporate a Slashdot rate the rater kind of an approach. And you have to do a couple of other things. And depending on how familiar you are with it, in Slashdot you have information that comes out, and then everybody gets to rate it, and then the rating of the person rating it determines what you see. So if I think John's great, because he's got a rating of 4 out of 5, then I can, say I want to follow John, or I want to set my bar and only see ratings by people who have a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5. We think that that's critical in any system that would come from a scholarly publishing standpoint. We also think, though, that you need to, for lack of a better term, goose the system, so to speak, grease the wheels a bit. And so if we were to look at that kind of a system, we would look at saying, okay, Sue's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. Clearly she should not have to rate 1,000 papers to try to get her rating up. So we would, based on certain criteria. Well,
it's not the Nobel Prize winners that are hard. It's the person like in the middle, like, all right, is this worthy of giving somebody more woofy points?
Right.
So the same thing. It's never the top or the bottom that's hard. It's always the middle.
Well, and that's we think that there's two things. One, it's damn freaking hard.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about that. And two, the only way you can get around it is to be completely transparent in the process, and this is where we're leaning at this moment in time, is actually allowing people to modify the transparent mechanisms. So if I say the top and the bottom are easy, and the middle is based on downloads as one criteria, and citations as another criteria, can you uncheck the box because you think downloads are meaningless and just have that rating point based on citations? Or if you think downloads are more important, uncheck citations. So we think that it's clearly got to be transparent, but in addition to transparent, it also has to be customizable by the user. And that's kind of getting back to the roll your own type of an approach. Now that takes a lot more technology, and we certainly won't be there with version 1, but that's clearly where we're heading.
Well, also 90% of your users aren't going to mess with it. They're going to use the default, whatever default you give them. The nudge problem. It's like, well, this guy says it's okay. The default